The station wagon hit the curve wrong and flipped twice before sliding to a stop in the dirt, and the first 3 crew members who started running froze mid-step when they realized whose car it was. Wait, because what happened in the next 18 minutes wasn't about the crash at all, and the reason John Wayne climbed out of that wreck to film the scene anyway would cost him something nobody on that set could see. Big Bear, September 1941. The morning air carried the smell of pine and diesel from the generator trucks, and if you'd been standing near the main set that day, you would have heard Henry Hathaway's voice before you saw him. The director was pacing near the camera rig, checking his watch every 40 seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't say out loud. The crew knew that look. It meant someone was late, and on Hathaway's set, late meant trouble. The scene they were shooting required full morning light, which gave them maybe 2 hours before the sun climbed too high and wrecked the shadows they needed. Hathaway had the whole thing blocked out, extras positioned, horses saddled, but the lead actor's chair sat empty. John Wayne was supposed to have been there 30 minutes ago. Notice something about the way the grips were moving equipment that morning, just a little slower than usual, stealing glances toward the access road. They knew, the assistant director knew. The script girl pretending to review her notes knew. Hell, half of Hollywood knew. But nobody said it out loud, because on a Hathaway picture, you didn't talk about what the director didn't want discussed. And Henry Hathaway definitely didn't want to discuss why his leading man kept showing up late with that specific look on his face. Marlene Dietrich was staying at the Lake Lodge, 3 miles down the mountain road. She'd driven up from Los Angeles 2 days after the production started, checked into a room with a view of the water, and made it very clear she had no intention of leaving until they wrapped. The studio hadn't invited her. She wasn't in the cast, but when Marlene Dietrich decided she wanted to be somewhere, contract clauses and call sheets didn't mean much. The affair had been going on for 18 months by then, and it was the kind of open secret that made people uncomfortable at industry parties. John was still married to Josephine. Marlene was still married to Rudolph, and every single person on that Big Bear location knew exactly why the Star's station wagon would come tearing up the access road at odd hours, why he'd show up to blocking rehearsals with that distracted energy, why Hathaway would get that tight look around his mouth whenever someone mentioned the lodge. "I didn't like having her around," Hathaway would say years later, when enough time had passed to make honesty easier. But here's what you need to understand about Henry Hathaway. Before we go further, he was the kind of director who'd fire an actor for showing up drunk, but he'd reshoot a scene 17 times if it meant getting the performance he wanted. He demanded perfection, but he also understood that perfection came from people, and people came with complications. The trick was knowing which complications you could work around and which ones would sink the whole production. This morning, standing in the cooling mountain air with 2 hours of good light burning away, Hathaway was doing the math on exactly how complicated things were about to get. 1 star, 1 affair, 1 production schedule. Nobody could afford to lose. The sound of an engine came first, distant, then closer, moving too fast for the mountain road. One of the grips turned toward the access road. The script girl looked up from her clipboard. Hathaway didn't move, but his hand went to his hip pocket where he kept his cigarettes, which was what he did when he was trying not to say what he was thinking. The station wagon came around the bend, doing at least 40, which was 15 miles too fast for that stretch of road. Later, people would argue about exactly what happened next, whether the left front tire caught the shoulder, or whether John just cut the angle too tight, but the result was the same either way. The wagon lurched right, overcorrected left, and when the wheels hit loose gravel, the whole thing went sideways. It flipped once, came down hard on the driver's side, flipped again, slid another 20 feet in a cloud of dust, and scattered pine needles before the momentum died, and left it resting on its roof like a tired animal. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the assistant director started running, and 2 grips followed, And that's when they all stopped, because they'd seen the car. They'd recognized it. And in that specific moment, every single person on that set had to make a choice about what they were going to pretend they didn't know. Remember this part, because it's the detail that makes the rest of it make sense. The first grip to reach the wreck looked back at Hathaway before he touched the door handle. Not for instructions, for permission. And Hathaway, standing 50 yards away with an unlit cigarette between his fingers, gave the smallest nod you've ever seen. The driver's side door was jammed. They had to pry it from the passenger side, and when John Wayne pulled himself out through the gap, there was blood running from a cut above his left eye, and his right shoulder was sitting wrong in a way that made the stunt coordinator wince. His costume shirt was torn at the collar. Dust covered him from head to boots. You could smell it on him, the sharp mineral scent of turned earth mixed with pine sap and something metallic that might have been blood or might have been adrenaline if adrenaline had a smell. He stood there for a moment, one hand braced against the overturned wagon, getting his breath, and nobody said a word. Not about why he was late, not about where he'd been, not about the fact that if you knew which window to look at in the lake lodge, you could probably still see a light on. John looked at the wreck, looked at the crew, looked at Hathaway. Then he started walking toward the set. His boots scraped against gravel with each step, and somewhere behind the equipment trucks, a horse stamped and snorted, picking up on the tension the way horses do. "Duke," the assistant director said, moving to intercept him. "We need to get you to—" "How much light do we have left?" John asked Hathaway directly. The director checked the sky, calculating the angle, the cloud cover, the way the sun was climbing over the ridge, hour and 40. "Then we're burning time. Listen carefully to what didn't happen next." Hathaway didn't argue. He didn't insist on a medic. He didn't ask the question everyone else was biting back. He just turned to the assistant director and said, "Get him cleaned up. 5 minutes." They used a costume towel to stop the bleeding, and someone found a clean shirt that more or less matched the continuity photos. John's shoulder was either dislocated or badly sprained. It was hard to tell through the adrenaline, but he could move his arm enough to hold a rifle, which was all the scene required. The makeup girl dabbed powder over the cut on his forehead and stepped back fast, like she didn't want to be part of whatever was happening. Her hands were shaking. You could hear the compact click shut, that tiny plastic snap that somehow cut through all the other noise. "You ready?" Hathaway asked when John reached his mark. John adjusted his gun belt with his left hand, and the leather creaked in the morning quiet, that specific sound a well-worn holster makes when you shift your weight. He kept his right close to his body. "Let's shoot it." They got the scene in 2 takes. John delivered his lines, hit his marks, drew the pistol with his left hand like the blocking called for. Halfway through the second take, the assistant director checked his watch and realized they had just under an hour of good light remaining. The sun was climbing faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge, throwing different shadows across the set with each passing minute. When Hathaway called cut the second time, John didn't wait for notes. He walked straight to his trailer, closed the door, and didn't come out for 3 hours. And this is where the first question finally gets answered. The one about what Marlene Dietrich would do when she found out. Here's what nobody wrote in the production reports. She showed up on set 40 minutes later in dark glasses and a scarf, carrying a covered dish that turned out to be some kind of German stew. The smell hit the set before she did. Rich meat and onions and something herbal that didn't belong in the California mountains, but somehow fit the moment anyway. She walked past Hathaway without a word, knocked on John's trailer door twice, and went inside. She stayed for 6 minutes. When she came back out, she walked past Hathaway again, and this time, she looked at him just long enough for him to understand that whatever needed to be understood had been handled. One look, one nod, one unspoken agreement that this particular morning would never make it into anyone's memoirs. The station wagon sat in the dirt for 2 more days before someone had it towed. By the time the sun was setting on that second day, that golden hour light that would have been perfect for the scene they'd scrambled to shoot, the story had made it through the whole crew, then back to Los Angeles, then into the kind of conversations that happened in studio offices behind closed doors. But the official version, the one that went in the files, said John Wayne had swerved to avoid a deer on the mountain road and lost control. Happens all the time up there. Dangerous curves. Lucky he wasn't hurt worse. If you want to understand why John Wayne agreed to film that scene, 18 minutes after crawling out of a wrecked car, you have to understand what was at stake. Not the schedule they could have pushed, not the light they could have matched it later, not even the money those studio executives were already calculating the cost of a delay. What was at stake was the thing that made men like Hathaway respect men like Wayne even when they were furious with them. The willingness to do the job no matter what it cost, to deliver what you'd promised, even when the promise had gotten complicated. But notice what it required. It required the crew to look away from what they knew. It required Hathaway to swallow his anger and focus on the work. It required John to separate the man from the actor, the private mess from the professional obligation. And it required everyone involved to maintain the fiction that none of this meant what it obviously meant. That's the part that stays with you. Not the crash. Not even the affair, which was already old news by Hollywood standards. It's the machinery of pretending. The way an entire film set reorganized itself around a story everyone knew was false, because the truth would have required conversations nobody wanted to have, and consequences nobody was ready to enforce. And here's the second answer. The bigger one about what this morning actually cost. John Wayne kept working with Hathaway for decades after Big Bear. They made 6 more films together, including True Grit, the one that finally won John his Oscar. In all those years, in all those interviews, neither man ever mentioned that morning when the station wagon went sideways on the mountain road. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It was just one of those things that stayed on the set, buried under the bigger legend they were building one scene at a time. The relationship with Marlene ended about a year later, not with drama but with distance, the way these things often do when the intensity burns out and what's left doesn't quite justify the complications anymore. John went back to Josephine for a while, then to other women, then eventually to Pilar, the one who'd end up writing about Marlene years after he died. And somewhere in those years, the story got refined, got simpler, got turned into the kind of anecdote you could tell at parties. The time Duke crashed his car because he was in such a hurry to get to set. Dedicated. That guy. Never missed a scene. But if you'd been standing there that September morning in Big Bear, watching a man pull himself out of a wrecked station wagon and walk directly into position for a camera setup, you would have seen something different. You would have seen the cost of maintaining the image. You would have seen what it took to be John Wayne, when John Wayne was just a name some studio executives had given to Marion Morrison, and Marion Morrison was a man trying to hold together a career and a marriage and a love affair all at the same time, and discovering that some mornings you can't hold all three. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. That station wagon stayed in studio storage for years before someone finally scrapped it. By then, the dent in the roof had become another prop in the story, another piece of evidence that something had happened even if nobody could quite agree on what it meant. And maybe that's the real legacy of that morning. Not what happened, but what everyone agreed to say happened instead, and the space between those two versions where the truth of being human got quietly set aside so the legend could continue.